Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Mellow Mike, and today we have a different kind of video. Another script of mine alongside poor discipline and scheduling has kept me from uploading, but today here for us I have a pretty zeitgeisty topic, dopamine, and specifically dopamine fasting, I guess. This video is a bit more off the cuff and will be a little less scripted, so with all that being said, grab a drink and hope you enjoy. So first I want to talk about what is a dopamine detox. So the idea started from a Californian psychiatrist named Dr. Seppa, who proposed 6 compulsive behaviors that have rewired or taken advantage of our biological systems, causing unhealthy habits, and was said to be associated with a lack of happiness in our modern world. The 6 behaviors are eating, internet usage, gambling and shopping, porn, novelty seeking, and rec drugs. The idea is that by abstaining from these behaviors, or as the self-help space purports, pleasurable things in general, you are able to reset your dopamine levels and thus exist at a happier baseline.
You need to perform a dopamine detox. By now, you might already have an idea what dopamine detox is going to look like. What you're going to do is set aside a day where you're going to avoid all the highly stimulating activities. You're going to stop flooding your brain with high amounts of dopamine, and you're going to let your dopamine receptors recover. For one whole day, you will try to have as little fun as possible. You won't be using the internet or any technology like your phone or computer. You're not allowed to listen to music, you're not allowed to masturbate or eat any junk food. Basically, you're going to remove all sources of external pleasure for the entire day.
The main conflation here is that dopamine is the pleasure chemical, and much like addicts who can have tolerance breaks to reset their sensitivity to a drug, by abstaining from pleasure, you can give your dopamine a tolerance break. The idea that dopamine is the main pleasure chemical is still very prevalent today.
Whenever something good and unexpected happens to you, the VK releases dopamine. This is what makes you feel pleasure. This pleasure is what fuels us to seek out goals and fulfill desires.
Many pundits in self-help space now use the phraseology of the neuroscience literature by describing dopamine as a chemical of wanting or motivation. However, the conflation still remains that pleasure is driven somehow by dopamine. Many seem to note the definition that dopamine is the chemical of more, but don't seem to appreciate the particularity of the wording, which to be fair isn't really their fault, as colloquial language necessitates some linguistic flexibility. However, in the sciences, this isn't afforded, and as we'll soon see, dopamine is truly the chemical of wanting, but not the chemical of liking as far as we can currently tell. To clarify these ideas, let's go over neurons briefly in a few studies that more precisely qualify dopamine's role in mammals. Hopefully, by interpreting these study results, we will have a more comprehensive and precise conception of dopamine and see from there what germane takeaways there may be for the idea behind dopamine detoxes. These will be brief descriptions of study findings, but feel free to pause the video and look at the slides and the actual study figures, or if you want, look up the specific citation that will also be listed. Okay, first off, neurons. So here we have 2 neurons. The spot where they join up and communicate is called the synapse. One neuron communicates with another neuron by releasing neurotransmitters which bind to receptors on the second neuron, causing a voltage change and thus further signaling. The second neuron can fire its own signal to other neurons, organs, muscles, and more. And the average neuron has 1,000 synapses, with areas of higher density in the brain containing neurons with over 100,000 synapses. The continual firing of the brain from one neuron receiving hundreds or dozens of inputs to then deciding and firing its own signal on a large scale is in effect what our brain does. We are constantly processing signals via our senses, and due to some genetic programming, we become obliged to partake in an activity or otherwise. But before we get carried away, first, how do we measure neuronal activity? So one way is by sticking electrodes in the skulls of our subjects, and another way is by using fluorescing receptors that fluoresce when their neurotransmitter substrate binds. And we can also use light-activated channels to stimulate neurons in particular areas that we know cause release of particular neurotransmitters to certain other areas. And so we will see these methods being used later. So where do these misconceptions about dopamine come from? Let's get into some studies. So studies like this had a rat hooked up to a lever and in this particular study they used the aforementioned light delivery method of stimulating neurons, and the stimulated area is considered the neural interface between motivation and action and is named the nucleus accumbens. The neurons that are projecting to the nucleus accumbens are dopaminergic, meaning that they use dopamine as their neurotransmitter. The results show that given a few days of training, the rats will learn to use the lever and stimulate these dopamine-releasing neurons, and it became like crack for them, essentially. In this study, social and sexual interaction increased natural dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. And in this study, cocaine increased dopamine release in proportion with the cocaine dosage. So in summary, things we find pleasurable like food, social and sexual interaction, and cocaine increase dopamine in the brain, and given the option, a rat will self-stimulate dopamine release in the brain. This reasonably suggests that dopamine causes the sensation of pleasure. But first, we need to distinguish hedonic impact or liking from incentive motivation or wanting. So liking is a subjective pleasure you feel from doing something, and wanting is the motivational force that causes the action in the first place. These two are often conflated because we commonly think I want to do something because I like doing it. However, the systems that govern our wants and our likes are separate, as you will soon see. A way to measure pleasure in science with food rewards is by lip licking or smacking. When presented sweet foods, a universal mammalian trait is to smack or lick their lips. And when presented bitter foods, a common behavior is to gape our mouths or wince. These can be viewed as proxies for independently measuring pleasure and not wanting, as they occur only as the reward is delivered. So does changing dopamine activity affect measures of pleasure? Let's find out. This study knocked out the gene that was responsible for the dopamine recycler, which ensured that excess dopamine didn't remain in the synaptic gap. And when given a sucrose solution, pleasure ratings were not notably different. The one statistically significant data point actually shows that the excess dopamine mutant group had less pleasurable reactions, which is the inverse of what we would expect if dopamine was responsible for pleasure. This study infused amphetamines to increase nucleus accumbens dopamine, but pleasure reactions were not significantly altered. In this study, they used a drug that blocked dopamine receptors, and measures of pleasure were again not significantly altered. This study showed that a rat will stimulate its own dopamine projections to the nucleus accumbens despite unpleasurable punishment. Additionally, Parkinson's patients have normal pleasure ratings for foods despite being depleted in dopamine. To summarize, increasing nucleus accumbens dopamine does not increase pleasure, decreasing nucleus accumbens dopamine does not decrease pleasure, and rats will proceed with unpleasant self-stimulation. These studies, along with many others throughout the course of the field's research, have shown that dopamine seems to be exclusively linked to a process that motivates behavior, and though pleasure is the feeling that we've cognitively labeled as the source that motivates behavior, other more primitive systems are also at play. Roy Wise, who was the original proponent of the hedonia dopamine hypothesis himself, wrote that, "I no longer believe that the amount of pleasure felt is proportional to the amount of dopamine floating around in the brain." So the field currently believes that the primary neurotransmitter system that is responsible for our subjective feeling of pleasure is the mu-opioid receptor system. I'm sure many of you have heard of opioids before, but they include things like heroin and also naturally produced endorphins. Here we see that an opioid receptor antagonist does block liking reactions, unlike a similar dopamine receptor antagonist experiment. So we now know pleasure and wanting are governed by separate systems in the brain that simply often run in parallel. And we know this because pleasure as we subjectively experience it seems to be related to the mu-opioid system rather than dopamine. So returning to dopamine, what is wanting exactly and how is it measured? Well, what experimenters have done is they ring a bell and present a rat food over and over. In time, the rat learns to associate the bell with food and thus will salivate or whatever else in expectation of the food. Separately, the rat is trained to press a lever for food. This way, both the bell and the lever are associated with the food, one as a signal to remind the rat of food, and the other as the rat's way to express its want for food. However, importantly, the bell and the lever are never presented together, meaning they are never specifically associated with each other. Then the bell and lever are presented together without food, and rats increase their lever pressing when they hear the bell, demonstrating they want the food, and since they don't get any food, pleasure is immeasurable here. And so, as we can see in this study, amphetamines that increase nucleus accumbens dopamine increase this lever pressing measure of wanting. In fact, in a different study, food cues only increased nucleus accumbens dopamine if the cue meant that the rat had to move to get the reward. So from these studies, it seems that dopamine is a precursor to movement. All in all, understanding dopamine's precise role should help clarify the boundaries of behaviors for developing healthy habits. Often misled conclusions touted by the self-help space can cause unhealthy behaviors, right? So dopamine can't be fasted from by simply avoiding pleasure. To wrap this portion of the video up, here's an article by Harvard Medicine titled "Dopamine Fasting, Misunderstanding Science Spawns a Maladaptive Fad." So let's put on my reading glasses here. You can't fast from a naturally occurring brain chemical. Dopamine is one of the body's neurotransmitters and is involved in our body's system for reward, motivation, learning, and pleasure. While dopamine does rise in response to rewards or pleasurable activities, it doesn't actually decrease when you avoid overstimulating activities, so a dopamine fast doesn't actually lower your dopamine levels. Unfortunately, legions of people have misinterpreted the science as well as the entire concept of a dopamine fast. People are viewing dopamine as if it were heroin or cocaine and are fasting in the sense of giving themselves a tolerance break so that the pleasures of whatever they are depriving themselves of, food, sex, or human contact, will be more intense or vivid when consumed again, believing that depleted dopamine stores will have replenished themselves. Sadly, it doesn't work that way at all. So what can we take away for dopamine detoxes, and what did Dr. Seppa really mean? So this is mainly what I think given my study of neuroscience, but I believe that Dr. Seppa meant that we should learn to be mindful with the behaviors we choose to engage in. Instead of hearing a notification beep and defaulting to checking your phone, just try to be aware. Do you ever get caught in an ever-scrolling trance on TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Reddit, Instagram, or whatever else? Or when you're in a certain environment, do you automatically feel compelled to consume rec drugs or porn or gamble or shop? And if you answered yes to any of those, then being mindful of your desires and instating healthy boundaries for yourself can be useful. But the answer to be happy is not to simply abstain from music, sports, social activity, eating, and in some cases even water, and just all pleasure altogether. So that is the limit of this so-called dopamine detox as far as I understand it. And so tell your friends, dopamine is not the pleasure chemical and liking isn't the same as wanting. Did you guys like this video format? Dopamine pun not intended, because dopamine is not responsible for liking, but please do give me feedback. Drop a like or dislike. Did adding my specific academic sources help, or was it a useless waste of time and excessive detail? Let me know down below. I welcome criticism, but with all that being said, this has been Mellow Mike. Until next time,